Welcome to a new episode of the Inequality podcast. My name is Gabriele Spilker and I'm a professor for international politics and global inequality and co-speaker of the Cluster of Excellence, the Politics of Inequality. And next to me, as always, sits
Marius Busemeyer. I am a professor of comparative political economy and speaker of the cluster here in Konstanz.
Our guest today is Helmut Rainer. Helmut is an applied microeconomist with a focus on labor and family economics. He's currently a visiting senior fellow at our cluster. And when he's not visiting our cluster, Helmut is a professor of economics at Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität, LMU, in Munich. And he's director of the Center for Labor and Demographic Economics at the IFO Institute in Munich. Helmut has researched and published on a wide range of topics, from domestic violence and fertility in Africa to taking part in protests organized by Fridays for Future. Most of his research is on inequalities related to gender, ethnicity, and citizenship rights, and how they affect labor market outcomes. A research agenda that is clearly and very well connected to our research at the cluster. So welcome, Helmut.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. And the focus of our today's podcast is on immigrant integration and labor market outcomes. And I would like to start with a potentially very general question. In your most recent research, your focus is on second-generation immigrants and their integration into the labor market. From an economic perspective, why is it important to focus on second-generation immigrants? And potentially also, why is this related to inequality?
One of the defining characteristics of our societies in Europe is population aging. And population aging has many consequences. For labor markets, it means it comes with labor shortages in many sectors. And, if we want to sustain economic growth, innovation potential, productivity, this requires us to think about, how to mobilize underutilized labor resources. And we don't have that many policy levers in this respect. So we can think about women in the labor market, how to increase their participation. We can think about older workers and how to extend their working lives. But then we can also, another very important group in this respect are immigrants. And in particular, their children born in the host country, so second-generation immigrants. So across Europe, in many European countries, also in Germany, this is a demographically very important group. So here in Germany, also in France, almost 1 in 5 individuals aged 15 to 25 have a migration background, so they are second-generation immigrants. But it also turns out that across Europe, they grow up with severe disadvantages. So they face a very high risk of childhood poverty. They carry forward these kind of childhood disadvantages into education in the labor market. So there's a high risk amongst them at age 15 to lack basic reading skills and a very high risk of them being unemployed when transitioning from the school system to the labor market.
Can you say how much of this disadvantage is sort of caused by these initial disadvantages in early childhood, and how much is then added throughout their educational careers? Because the education system certainly also adds some disadvantages that migrant children are treated differently in school and so on.
So I think, let me just give one example of the disadvantages that are very specific to the second generation. And that has to do with the host country language. Many immigrant groups in Germany, or children from many immigrant groups in Germany, face a high risk of growing up in households, in homes where German is not spoken as the native tongue. And this is, of course, a key factor that holds them back in the education system. And it generates disadvantages that's very difficult for them to overcome in their entire schooling career. So that's one disadvantage that's very specific to certain immigrant groups in Germany, but elsewhere as well.
And you see differences across different immigrant groups? I mean, are there cultural differences maybe with regard to
So
this?
I have studied extensively second-generation immigrants with a Turkish background. They are the largest group in Germany. And this is the one group where I can say, also based on empirical facts, that this is certainly the case. I don't want to can't say too much about other groups, but they are also typically much smaller and a bit more fractionalized. So, rigorous empirical evidence on this is a bit more difficult to come by for these other groups.
Yeah.
Speaking about language disadvantage, I mean, one policy lever you study is early childhood care. And how does this relate to this language aspect, for instance? So I imagine that this has a pretty strong influence on language uptake.
Exactly. So in my recent work, we look at 2 interventions in early childhood and study their long-term impacts on the outcomes of second-generation immigrants when they transition from the schooling system to the labor market. And so one of these policies is really giving children extra childcare. And it's giving them extra childcare, roughly 5 to 6 months of extra childcare at the age of 3. And this is, of course, a critical age for language acquisition. And it is kind of an intervention where one would think that it has a disproportionately strong impact on second-generation immigrants, exactly for the reason that I just highlighted, because they do often grow up in homes where German is not used as the mother tongue. So having this extra 5 or 6 months of early childcare at the age of 3 means, of course, they are now exposed no longer to these kind of, let me put it like this, disadvantaged homes, but they will have interactions in kindergartens with other natives. They will be exposed to the German language. And this is, of course, a fairly small change in early livelihood conditions, but of course these changes can then kind of accumulate over time to produce persistent, long-lasting effects on the second generation.
If I'm not mistaken, this is exactly what your research shows, that these kids profit from this extra month of early childhood.
Exactly, yeah.
But maybe also from a research design perspective, so to speak, how can you actually do this? Did you sort of trace the children from age 3 until they're then finally on the labor market, or how can you manage to find these effects as a researcher over such long periods of time?
Okay, excellent question, thank you. So we leverage a fairly unique setting in Germany. So we focus on a few cohorts of children born in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And their environment changed due to reforms. So first of all, in the late 1990s, there was an expansion of childcare for 3 to 6-year-old kids in Germany. And these expansions came with age enrollment cutoffs. And because of your birth date, this ultimately meant that some kids could start early childcare at the age of 3, while other kids had to wait for a few more months. And
until summer happened and the regular...
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And the specific birth date cutoff that's really relevant for our study is January 1st. So if you are born in December of a given year, as opposed to being born in January of the next year, you will have 5 months extra childcare at the age of 3.
Interesting.
And we are also studying a second policy. So there was also a second policy change in the late 1990s, and that was the introduction of birthright citizenship. And that reform, this introduction, also came with a very same birth date cutoff. So it was implemented on 1st January 2000. So if you are a child with a migration background and you were born in December 1999, you wouldn't benefit from the reform. But if you were born in January 2000, you would be a beneficiary of that reform. And this is exactly the birth date cutoff that we are leveraging for 3 consecutive birth cohorts in Germany to study the long-term effects of these 2 policies.
And just to clarify, that doesn't mean that these other kids were not able to get the German citizenship at all. It just meant that for those born after the deadline, it was easier,
so
right?
That was
automatic.
The birthright citizenship reform was the introduction. So you would, if you benefited, so if you were eligible for the reform, you would automatically become a German citizenship at birth. The parents couldn't renounce the child's citizenship. It was really literally recorded in your birth certificate.
So maybe also to our listeners, this is I think also the typical economist approach, if I may say so, to look for these instances where you have a random element to some extent. Whether you're born on December 31st or January 2nd is to some extent a random thing, but this cutoff point has real effects, as you say. You either get half a year or 5 months extra childcare, you get a citizenship or not. So this is a big change, but the randomness is around that cutoff date. And
we are literally studying kids who were born just before this cutoff date versus kids being born just after this cutoff date to identify the long-term effects of these two policies.
The causal effect.
Exactly. And speaking of the long-term effects, it's still super interesting, and we have not heard enough about how you measure these long-term effects. So how do you trace these kids then 20, 25 years later?
Yeah, so exactly. The study is very data hungry because of comparing kids who are born very close to this birth date cutoff. And so what we are leveraging is social security data from Germany. So and that's covering all individuals who've ever been employed, subject to social security, or have participated in active labor market policy. And
that's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people, yeah.
And it's also a lot of these young people, right? I mean,
Exactly.
because you made sure that you told us before that most of these kids were in some sense part of this registry, either because they handed out newspapers, right? Or
Exactly.
worked at a coffee place. And
there are some challenges that we had to overcome with this data set. So one challenge is that we do not observe migration background directly, but we do observe the names of individuals in these social security records. And based on the names and using onomastic procedures,
What does that mean, onomastic? What is it?
These are just algorithms that assign to names a certain country of origin. The really important group that we wanted to identify are second-generation immigrants with a Turkish background. And they have fairly unique names. And so this is why our algorithm does a very good job in identifying them as being second-generation immigrants.
But we cannot be 100% sure, but it's, of course,
so
parents that give their children a typical German name,
correct,
for instance.
But we've also fielded a survey, which we can link back to the social security data, and that serves as a robustness check for this onomastic algorithm.
But maybe also just coming back to the actual to the findings. So you mentioned that this provision of extra childcare has a positive effect on the young adults. But what about citizenship rights? I mean, I assume this is also a little bit of a positive effect. But here it's for me a little bit harder to understand why that actually occurs. Just giving citizenship, why does it have positive effects?
This is really you could say it's really a minor change in a child's life because it's basically just being given a passport at birth.
Yeah.
And by the way, we find that just as much as early childcare, growing up as a German citizen also has very positive impacts on second-generation immigrants in the long term. It increases their likelihood. Just as an example, to attend college at age 22, it reduces their probability of being on welfare also quite significantly. Okay. So very similar positive effects as early childcare, but the mechanisms are very likely very different. In earlier work that I've done also with a University of Konstanz researcher, Christina Felver, we've shown that already in childhood, having benefited from the citizenship reform, improved the educational outcomes of second-generation immigrants.
Interesting.
And so how can you explain that? I mean, the perhaps most plausible explanation would be that it changes how parents invest in their children's human capital. The idea being that with growing up as a citizen means that immigrants have the same opportunities as their native counterparts. In theory, this should increase the returns to investing in children's human capital. And what we have shown in earlier work that this seems to be indeed the case. So immigrant children who benefited from that reform had better language skill at age 5. And we've used school entry data from school entry examinations to demonstrate that a lower probability of repeating a grade in primary school and they had a much higher probability of being dragged into the academic track of high
gymnasium.
school, in the gymnasium.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. So a very likely channel explaining all of this is really a change in how parents invest in their children's human capital. Then, of course, later when they are adolescents and realize also that as German citizens, or realize all the chances that German citizenship affords them, it could also increase their aspirations looking ahead. And we've also found some evidence for that in some other work that we've been doing on the more short and medium run effects of this citizenship reform.
Super interesting. Is this the same for boys and girls? I remember that there might be some differences.
So in one study, we've really zoomed in on immigrant girls, and we've zoomed in on immigrant girls from very traditional backgrounds. And background we've measured through religious backgrounds. And there is this one striking finding. So there's this one subgroup of second-generation immigrants, and these are immigrant girls with a Muslim religious background, for whom the reform seemed to have backfired at the age of 15. Backfired in the sense of it did. So the Muslim immigrant girls who benefited from the reform showed much lower levels of life satisfaction, so measures of subjective well-being, self-esteem at the age of 15 compared to those who didn't benefit from the reform. Digging deeper into this, what seems to be driving this are actually cultural conflicts, cultural intergenerational conflicts between parents and their daughters. And so the broad idea, and we've presented evidence for this, is that for the girls themselves, the reform raises aspirations, for example, to attend college later on. Parents actually sabotaging these integration efforts for the simple reason, and so I mean there's broader research on immigrant girls, that immigrant girls from very traditional backgrounds, they're often brought up as being keepers of the culture. So parents have certain expectations for them, raising families. And so there's this kind of tension between what ideas parents have for their daughters and what their daughters themselves are actually aspiring to. And this is exactly the intergenerational conflict that describes this drop in well-being, self-esteem for the girls who actually benefited from the reform.
I mean, it sounds a little bit also, of course, we had similar processes in Germany with the changing gender role models in the post-war decades and so on.
Exactly, yeah.
But that doesn't, on your previous results, I guess the policy recommendations would be pretty easy in the sense of it seems to be really beneficial to offer immigrant kids this.
So maybe I should say
benefits.
something on the immigrant girls. The very last finding that we have actually presented in this study is about the outlook that these girls have on their future life. So while their situation at age 15 or 16 seems to be tough, exactly, they have a very positive outlook on their future. So we've also asked questions about their expected life satisfaction 5 years down the line. And using that question, it seems that they had a very positive outlook. So, looking forward at the time when they probably had the chance to leave the parental home, for this kind of, future scenario, they had actually a very positive outlook.
But maybe, from your own research or maybe from other research that is this this kind of effect of discrimination in the early years and then potentially through interventions, less discrimination? Is this something unique to Germany because of the stratified education system that we have, because of the maybe other countries doing better in terms of integration? Or do you see, is this pretty, can you observe something like that in other countries as well?
Our study looks at 2 interventions, and what is unique about Germany is that it is and this is now about the citizenship policy. Yeah. Germany is the only major immigrant receiving country that has introduced birthright citizenship over the past decade. So in that respect, Germany really offers this unique, if you want, laboratory to study the effects of birthright citizenship in the short run, in the medium run, and in the long run. We do have evidence on early childcare interventions from other countries. So, you have some targeted programs in the US. Head Start is a very famous program And there's a fairly broad body of research that has looked at the long-term impacts of this kind of early childhood schooling programs on disadvantaged children. And our research relates to that literature. And by the way, finds similar effects that has been highlighted in this literature.
Currently, there's this discussion in Germany that so you're studying birthright citizenship, of course, but of course there are other different ways of becoming a German citizen.
Sure.
And the last government has made this easier to obtain, and now the discussion is of rolling that back. I mean, I know that it's a bit of a leap from your results to more general questions of granting citizenship, but would you say granting citizenship is, from an economic perspective, something that should be made not too easy probably, but should be made easier? Or is that really only true if we're thinking about birthright citizenship and these longer term investments?
Yeah, so my assessment of the broader literature, not just the literature on birthright citizenship, but also on the literature on naturalization, is that facilitating access to birthright citizenship from an economic perspective seems to be almost a no-brainer for the following reason. I mean, it is a policy that comes at hardly any cost for governments. It's very different from building whatever, have targeted childhood programs. These are usually very expensive. Making access to citizenship easier has maybe administrative costs. But when compared to the potential benefits that easier access to citizenship brings to immigrants, but then also to their host societies, I think, this cost-benefit ratio is, very favorable.
That's a good point. But besides the disadvantages that are related to migration background, can you also say something about other types of disadvantages, especially, there might be native children coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, also struggling in school. Is childcare also good for them, or is it hard to say?
I mean, that's an excellent question. And that's a question that we so far didn't manage to address in our study. And the reason is data limitations. So to answer the question, you would need to have some information about these young adults' backgrounds, their parents' backgrounds. And we have not managed to link generations in this social security data. But the good news is that researchers at the University of Konstanz, Sebastian Findeisen, and I think a PhD student of his, have actually made these links. And so our hope is to, at some point, maybe to strike a collaboration, and then this would be a super interesting question to study. I mean, do we see similar positive effects for, say, natives from low SES backgrounds than we do for second-generation immigrants? I think it's a super important question.
And it's also because your trick with the names doesn't really work so well with a native SES, low SES.
No, the issue is that to really have information on background, you would almost need to know something about the parents. So we have not been able to link young adults to their parents, but we would need to have information on the labor market history of their parents to have some proxy for socioeconomic background. And so this is something that is very high on our to-do agenda, and hopefully in collaboration with researchers from the University of Konstanz and from the cluster.
And we're definitely looking forward to knowing more about this in the future. One more question on maybe more policy-related outcomes of your work. I mean, you do a lot of policy recommendations. You work closely together with policymakers. The results you find in your studies, are they easy to communicate? And do you have the feeling that politicians and policymakers listen to these advices? I mean, for me, what you present is very clear-cut evidence, both in favor of more early childhood care and education. Birthright citizenship, you said, is a no-brainer. But still, there seem to be all these discussions about that. So what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to it. Let me give you an indirect answer, maybe. So here's an observation that I have. Historically, many immigrant-receiving countries have made efforts to integrate immigrants into their societies. This is clearly changing. So, historically, we had very relatively inclusive policy frameworks in regards to immigration. This is changing, right? So many supports that immigrants receiving are currently being withdrawn in many countries. Maybe the most extreme example is actually discussions in the United States about ending birthright citizenship.
Yeah.
And I think the results of our study, it has implications for this kind of changing policy paradigms in a way. So think of the US, for example, and suppose that at the federal level, birthright citizenship is being stopped. There will still be states in the US, on the West Coast, California, on the East Coast, who will want to continue to support the integration of immigrants. You could say that one implication of our research would be that, well, if we do stop birthright citizenship, then we need some substitutes. And the substitute could be to encourage immigrant families, to encourage more take-up of early childcare amongst families and think about incentives that would get them to do so. So that's kind of a broad policy implication that one could draw from our study.
Yeah, this is also something I wanted to ask about, because looking at this from the childcare angle, at least in Germany, as far as I know the data, we also know that the participation, especially in childcare below the age of 3, so something that you do not study directly, the participation rates of those from ethnic minorities is much lower than for natives.
So that would also be an implication for Germany, right? So we have this 2-tier system for early childcare for 3 to 6 year olds, but then also childcare for under 3 year olds. Yeah. So I think take-up rates for children aged 3 to 6 are universally very high across different groups in our society. But that's no longer the case for childcare for under 3 year olds. Yeah. And encouraging take-up in this group, especially for immigrant populations, could be a policy that might pay off in the long term.
Yeah, but do you have any, there is a program in Brazil, I think it's called Bolsa Familia, right, where they basically pay families to send their children to school. Would that be such an intervention, or is that maybe a little bit too drastic?
It would be super interesting to kind of conduct research on this, but maybe it's also about information provision to immigrant families that could do the trick. But I think this would be a super interesting kind of avenue area for future research as well.
Interestingly, I guess from a policy maker perspective, the very same forces that have potentially trouble with birthright citizenship are also the very same ones that might not be in favor to encouraging families to send their kids to school or to kindergarten very early, which is, given your findings, rather unfortunate, because it would benefit both the kids as well as long-term wise also our economy, I guess. Perfect. Thank you. I think we are at the end of this podcast. Thank you very much, Helmut, for this super interesting discussion and the findings. Just to summarize what we have talked about in this podcast, Helmut told us about his research on both early childhood care and birthright citizenship and the very unique situation of Germany, which at the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, had these policy reforms that provided for some kids who were born after a specific date, the option to have 5 more months of childcare and birthright citizenship. And what Helmut and his team, what they show is that this has long-term policy of long-term effects for our labor markets and positive effects not only for the labor markets but also for these adults, and therefore should be, as you said, no-brainers in terms of policy recommendations. So thank you very much for listening, and listen in to the next Inequality podcast every first Wednesday of the month. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.